Hey, I'm Natalie. I'm a volunteer here with YA Lit, and I will be our hopefully.
No, yes.
I'm sorry, I got lost.
You're fine. So now we're all here. Excellent. Woo! Perfect timing. We were just getting started. So I would love to have everybody introduce themselves and tell me what is your favorite sci-fi world. It doesn't have to be YA.
Hello, my name is Michael Chatfield. I write science fiction, fantasy, and video game related books called Lit RPG. I would have to say one of my favorite worlds I don't know. That's a good one.
It's like your favorite child. Like, what kind of question is that?
Yeah.
It's a mean one.
And sometimes they kind of blend together because you get like really good ones. I would say John Ringo, the Hotgate series.
Hi, I'm Diana Peterfreund. I write lots of different genres. Sometimes it's sci-fi. I definitely cannot say like my favorite sci-fi series. I think, when I was young, it was Star Wars. I've really been enjoying Marvel recently. And on television right now, my favorite sci-fi show is, I don't know if The Good Place counts as sci-fi. It's right up there. And also The Orville. If you're not watching The Orville, it's really good.
Hi, I'm Jonathan Maberry. I write the Rotten Ruins series, the Joe Ledger series, a bunch of other stuff, and Viewers, which is going to be a Netflix show with Ian Somerhalder in December. My favorite sci-fi world is, most of you are probably too young to remember, but Roger Zelazny's Amber. Brilliant series of political and weird fantasy, and people travel through tarot cards to other dimensions. And it's absolutely a wonderful world.
Hi, I'm C.D. Lee. I'm the author of the Sidekick Squad series, which is about a group of queer teens that take on a corrupt government superhero agency. My favorite sci-fi worlds, I have to say, would be Star Wars and, The Good Place is one of my recent favorites as well. I have to say Star Wars, and also I'm going to do a shout out to the Penumbra podcast and the Bright Sessions, which are amazing narrative podcasts out right now.
My name is Claudia Gray. I write YA science fiction and fantasy, including the Firebird series and the Constellation series, as well as some Star Wars tie-ins. I can't pick a single favorite universe, so I'm going to say my comfort universe, the place I go when I need to just feel totally chilled. Yeah, that's Star Trek. It's like, yes, I just want to hear Captain Picard talk. In a land of peace and happiness, and you can get hot chocolate from the wall anytime you want.
I like that, Claudia. I like that comfort, because I think that's what all of this stuff is for us, isn't it? It's sort of like comfort places, comfort worlds. My name is Cecil Cataloochee. I write young adult books. I write contemporary books about nerds, and I also write science fiction. I have a sci-fi duology called Tin Star. I've done a Star Wars tie-in, and I write Batgirl right now for DC Comics, amongst many other things. I'm going to say the one that made me fall in love first with telling stories was Star Wars when I first saw episode 4. So that was like my love. But lately, I've really been enjoying the way, and maybe this is controversial, but the new Star Trek, the way that they've been, that they completely reimagined that world, that sort of marries that idea of it being a comfort place, but also being something sort of brave and new and completely unexpected. And so I like that kind of marriage of the new Star Trek.
Awesome. So when y'all are building these sci-fi worlds, how do you start? Where do you begin imagining these things? Is it the gadgets? Is it space? Is it a tech? Like, what is it specifically? Where do you start that like brings you in? And like Claudia, she looks like she's got something to say.
It depends on the series and the book in question. What does it need? With the Firebird series, it's about the daughter of 2 famous scientists chasing her father's killer through alternate dimensions. So the first question I had to answer is, what is she using to do that, and how does it work? And that was my first science fiction book, and I hadn't realized how hard it was, because this is clearly fantasy science. We're nowhere near being able to go to any alternate realities. Although I was surprised how, like, scientists all agree, like, oh yeah, they exist. But I thought there would be a little more disagreement. They were like, but it had to feel like a scientific instrument. It couldn't feel like a magic thing she had. It had to have very specific limits and very specific things it could and could not do. And so after I had the tech, then I could figure out each dimension that she went to. And I would love to tell you I had a really like clever and insightful formula for that. But honestly, with that entire series, it was what would be cool? What would be really cool? All right, she's going to go to a version of medieval Rome where there are no gender roles, and so there's a Pope Martha III. Done. With the Constellation series, that was about coming up with sort of the government is set 300 years in the future, and you have different colony worlds. But it's at a point where the colony worlds are starting to break off from Earth. They kind of have their own cultures now, and they don't necessarily want to do what Earth says do. So it was sort of figuring out those planets, how they were connected, and that politics, I guess.
Sorry, I'll just go. I think for me, so with the Tin Star series, it's about a girl named Tula Bane who is on a pilgrimage and gets beaten and abandoned and left on an alien space station. And she's the only human there for many years. And so she has to start behaving like an alien in order to survive because there are no other humans. And for me, that was character. Was the first thing, like what would it be like to be the only human in that place? But also, I based it on Casablanca, the movie Casablanca. So for me, it was sort of like taking the politics of the resistance during World War II and the Vichy government and all that, and sort of morphing that onto galactic politics and sort of expanding out from there. So for me, it's sort of like I get like an idea, like a character and idea at the same time, and then I'm like, ooh, I want to watch that, or I want to see that, what's going to happen? So then you just naturally, for me, follow the character and talk to a lot of scientists.
I think that, with any story, there's like a spark, right? It's I want to do Casablanca, or I've got a character who needs the box. Like I'm a big fan of setting out the rules of the world. It's like my lawful orientation. And so when I was writing like the Omega City series, I kept thinking to myself, I don't want anything that is too far fantasy. Like I wanted everything in the book to either be stuff that was invented, stuff that was patented, stuff that you might go to like a technology expo and see, but like never makes it to market for whatever reason. So like I didn't want anything in there that wasn't real. So in the third book, when they go to outer space, my editor like sent back revisions, and she's like, it's really difficult that there's no gravity. It makes it like really hard sometimes to understand what's going on in the scene. Can you just make like an anti-gravity thing? And I was like, no. And she's like, but they have one in the Death Star. I'm like, yes. So, I was like, well, yeah, we can't do that, but like, I'll make a ring and I'll say like, this ring is so big so they can have this much partial gravity, so it's like gravity on the moon or whatever. And if you look at it, there's a lot of theoretical bases for these like rotating rings and space stations, whatever. Anyway, it's really cool, but you should read about it. But making those rules made it really easy for me to be like, what can I put in this book? What can't I put in this book? And so, like my friend joked, she's like, this is your hard sci-fi middle grade. And I'm like, yes, it is. It is. It's hard sci-fi.
It's fine. For me, the first thing I thought of was, how do I destroy the world and then rebuild it? Thank you. So there's superpowers in my universe. So the first thing I was like, well, what is the origin of powers, and how do people have powers and why? So I thought of like a solar flare that ignited like a very latent gene in people. And then I also I really am inspired by a lot of like post-apocalyptic fiction, but I wanted to look more closely at not just like the middle of the chaos, the middle of the destruction and disaster, but how people were rebuilding. So a lot of I would describe my books as very solar punk, because they're about countries that have reimagined themselves. They use a lot of clean energy and a lot of tech, but at the same time, there's a lot of corruption and other stuff. But that was kind of the basis for the world, was figuring out how the superpowers work first, and then
all these natural disasters, and then kind of redrawing the map of the world and how different governments formed, and then looking at the governments and all their economic shenanigans.
For me, I'm a very practical guy, so I like practical world building, and for me it's also world building as needed. I hate info dumps. Sometimes it's important to give a big chunk of something, but most often I like to world build as the characters need it to happen. So in the Rotten Ruins series, my first YA series, it's set 14 years after the zombie apocalypse. So people are living in this little small fenced-in town, and the two kids are looking for a job. They have to get jobs at 15. So by looking for jobs, I had them go to the types of jobs that would exist in that world. So they get to, we as the reader get to experience parts of the daily life or the ongoing world of this town. Like, for example, there's one job that's called erosion artist. If you want to find a friend or family member who's become a zombie, and you want someone to go out and quiet them, which is, kill them so that they are at peace. If you have a photo or can describe that person, an artist will then draw them how they might look as a zombie, so the bounty hunters can go find them. That's a job that would only exist in that world. There's another one at a factory making cadaverine. Cadaverine is this chemical produced by putrescence, by rotting flesh. So if you put it on you, you smell like a rotting corpse, so the zombies don't bite you. So that's a job. It's a horrible job. So each of the jobs they go to not only tell you about what goes on in the town, but what's going on in the world without having to give a big explanation of this is what's happening in the world. And as the characters go through the story, to go to different elements of that world, that has to change. I recently did sort of a spin-off series called Broken Lands, where it takes place in another part of the country. They don't know anything about the people living in California. So their entire world, since the apocalypse, developed on its own. They have different customs for handling the living dead. There's different slang terms to describe the living dead. It's the same country, but they're like separate countries because of the distance and isolation. So I got to explore how world building is viewed, or the world is viewed, by different characters in isolation within the same world. It allows me to rebuild the world.
That's super cool.
So I want Michael to answer the question, but I also want to add in an additional question: is how much world building do you do specifically in the text versus outside of the text for your own sort of understanding of the world you're playing in?
So I would say that with world building comes down personally to three different ways. Propulsion, this sounds kind of weird, but propulsion of how are you getting from point A to point B? Are you using spaceships, are you using hovercraft, and then if you're using a spaceship, are you using like a warp drive, are you using a bubble drive, what's your way of getting in between stuff? Because that usually changes the world and how it exists according to that. It's got to be realistic, so lots of science books. The internet's amazing, and the NSA probably doesn't want to know anything that's on any of our search histories at this point. And then characters. So is it a gritty world, so it's going to be harder to get it from place to place? Is it not a gritty world, so it's easier to get from place to place, and that kind of thing? And personally for development, I would say I do a lot of the world is built before, just because then it's kind of a sandbox. So I have like the walls that are done, and then I just have the characters go in there and then throw things at them. And we see what happens by the end of it. But then, of course, as the characters go on, that's more in the text development.
I really like the point that Jonathan made about
making it feel like it's lived in, making it feel really organic. I think sometimes where, I don't want to point a finger at YA specifically, but sometimes in YA, you'll see the writer has created a world, but then they haven't actually dealt with the consequences of what people living in that world would do. Like the opposite of that kind of experiences. I always thought it was really interesting in the Hunger Games, for example, that the people who won the Hunger Games had a benefit, right? Like for their entire district. So it was to their benefit for people to, once they start winning the Hunger Games, to just the districts 1 and 2 and stuff that picked children and trained them to be killers from a young age, because they were like, if this is the only way to get food into our district, we have to train people to do that. And that would be how it really works. If you go to
more like countries that are dystopian, you know, like Cuba and stuff, like you see people hustling in ways and like making things work because you're not just going to take the rules as they sit there, like you're going to figure out how to win the game. And so I always appreciate in the books where you see that there are these jobs that have grown up just because it's a job that people would have and stuff like that, or you see that they would volunteer districts to become assassins because that's the way to win the Hunger Games. And obviously that would be a thing that would really happen.
Yeah, one quick thing about the lived-in look. I was inspired by that, by the original Star Wars film, New Hope, because everything looked gritty and lived in. Nothing was shiny. Everything was battered and dented and rusted a little bit, the way it would in a world where this stuff is used all the time. I dislike science fiction where everything is gleaming, polished, stainless. It just doesn't look real to me. That wouldn't be how it is. I mean, I own a new car, but I also live in Southern California. And every 2 days, that car looks like it's been sitting out, you know, in dust storms for months. You know, just that's the way. So if every car in a movie set in my town was shiny and polished, that would be an unrealistic world building. Now, as far as to answer the second part of your question about how much of it, you know, do I do? I usually start letting the story tell it to me, and then I make notes of it. Sometimes I will go, if I know that the plot really depends on knowing a lot more about the world, I'll draft out stuff. But I you know, even though I'm a plot guy, I tend to leave a lot for organic storytelling, because sometimes a plot point tied to world building may occur to you in the writing. And I just don't assume that I'm going to have all my best ideas the day I either plot my book or craft my world. I have to allow the story to be a partner, so to speak, in building that world.
Do you guys ever do you ever do this where you put something in a story and you don't know why, you just think it's cool, and then you're like 3/4 of the way into the story and you're like, oh, this is actually super important to my plot, and my subconscious has finally like made the neural connection of why.
I did that with, I had high-speed hover trains, and so like, oh, that's just how like the major cities are connected. And then in the third book, I was like, well, there's gonna be a train heist. And that whole scene and like all of these, like how it got set up, and I was building towards it without realizing like, oh, it was the perfect way to build towards that. But I really love what you said also about making the world feel lived in. Is I always think like with tech, I think about like, well, how it's gonna break.
With the Constellation series, I built that out a little bit more, sort of when the colony worlds would have been settled, and sort of what they were settled for. The original purpose of them would have really affected the culture that they now are beginning to have. They're no longer just people who came from Earth. They don't think of themselves as people from Earth anymore. So there I did more building out of the tech and the way that things would work, but still mostly like thought like, how is this working with the story?
You know, I think just to jam off of what Jonathan was saying too, is that like the future doesn't spring forth just perfectly gleaned. Like a modern city is born out of the rubble and the ruins, or the scaffolding of what was there before. So even now, if we were to have like new green cities and green initiatives in New York or Los Angeles, everywhere, Atlanta, those green buildings would spring forth from what is already there. And so that's, I think, what's interesting to me when you're world building like that. For Tin Star, you know, pretty much all of the book takes place in outer space, but there are some sort of like flashbacks to her time on Earth, and Earth has been sort of decimated with like, you know, dust storms, and that's why, you know, like nobody can eat, and that's why people are trying to leave. And you know, it's like, but you have to make that real. Like, how would people try to live in a world where you can't plant any food? You know, but that's on the infrastructure of what we have, you know, here already. But you know, I use a lot of that stuff too. I try to think about it even when I'm writing, you know, superhero comics. You know, like you do. You know, where it's like, you know, like with Batgirl right now. She's got, you know, an AGI robot that's in her life, maybe in a bad way, and so, you know, it's like I'm trying to sort of figure out how to make that as real as possible, you know, spring it forth from what we have actually now to where we could go with that.
So how much of this comes out in revision for your stories when you're you're imagining things, and then obviously things are going to have changed as you go along. So how much of it kind of gets layered in later?
I think definitely like one of the things is like sometimes you have to have a smart solution. So either like you'll be like, oh, this is perfect. I seeded this 3 books ago and I had no idea that this was going to work, and then it somehow does. Or sometimes you're like, oh, okay, we're going to have to really figure this out, or we're going to have to like meld other systems we've got together. Or you find that you can't do it. Sometimes you'll be going through and you're like, I really wanted this to get to this point, and the characters were like, no, technology's like, that's impossible, and then you can't do it. Especially if you're doing like hard science fiction, because you might have fans that'll send angry letters to you and say, this will never work. So that definitely happens.
I'm sort of like a terminal planner and plotter when it comes to things. I've definitely been known to call up my editor and been like, has the book gone to print yet? Because I'm like working on like book 3, right, and book 2, and I was like, I have to put this in. I have to put it in or book 3 won't work, you know, kind of thing. So I try to get things sort of settled as far in advance as possible and make sure I've thought of every avenue that I need for the future plots, because I've been in situations where I'm like, oh man, I gotta do a lot of retconning to make this work, and I don't like to do that, because then even if the reader can't see the seams, I can see the seams, and it's always like this little false note. And you know, I think it must be really hard if you're like in television, if you're writing in television and things are getting filmed, you know, as you're writing episodes, like you don't have the many rounds of revisions and like, well, this wasn't in the arc, but it's in the final kind of thing that my editors hate me because I'm always revising my ARCs.
But that's the same thing like with comic books. Like when you're doing a monthly comic book, you have to make a choice. You've got 6 weeks with you and the artist to make that comic book, and it has to come out every single month. So sometimes you screw yourself because you've done something somewhere and you're like, this is the logical thing, but you have to, you know, I mean, of course, like with DC Comics and Marvel and whatever, sometimes they're like, hand wave it. Right, you're like, you're no longer dead. You can just like retcon it, you know, like.
Now we're on Earth 917.
Exactly. But that's like, yeah, but it's like, I feel like it's like television in that way where you have to really, you can plan as best as you can, but character is going to dictate stuff to you, and things are going to change. And like, I'm sorry, I don't know what your name is.
I'm Mike Chatfield.
Hi. You know, like he was saying, like sometimes your character is like, guess what? Now we're going this way. Or now I'm the star, and you're like, what? That's not what my plan was. But when you're doing a monthly comic book, you just have to kind of have to surf the wave, you know. And that's actually been helpful for me in novel writing, because now I feel a little bit braver about not planning everything out, you know.
Yeah. Speaking of comics, I'm also in the comic space. When I was writing for Marvel, sometimes you, as you said, you plot something out, and it's the most logical version until you've actually gone in and written the comics and sent them off, and then it's like, well, that was the most logical version at the moment, based on how awake I was, how much coffee I'd had when I'd done that, and now it's not. So there's a lot of fixing that happens along the way. Hopefully the readers don't see it. Yeah.
Well, and also because, you know, when you're dealing with a shared universe, right? You don't like, I mean, I just found out that Batgirl is in another thing, and I'm like, oh crap, I didn't account for that. Yeah. So now I gotta you know, like account for her missing time because of that, you know. Yep. So yeah, it's complicated.
But as far as what gets, you know, how much is left in, how much is taken out, I tend to overwrite my books deliberately because I love a lot. I info dump when writing, and I cut it way back for the draft.
You can like kill them all, like take them.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's, like for example, I do a lot of research with scientists for my novels and comics. So even in the Rot and Ruin series, I knew that by the 3rd and 4th book, I was going to give the science behind the plague that ended the world, and I had done the research, and I loved the science, and I threw it all in there in draft. And what had to be a 110,000 word book when done was 162,000 words, because I would just dump, literally cut and paste the science in there, and then go through and just take out like a half a line here, a sentence there, and pare it down so it's only what would be said in conversation, the version of the science that people would actually say to one another, depending on who the other person was. So if they were talking to an adult who understood science, it might be said one way. If they were talking to a teenager who smart teenager but who doesn't understand science, it would be said a different way. So I fine-tune it down to what's the most realistic way to say that given the scene. A lot of stuff gets cut out, but also a lot of stuff can be implied too. If you trust the reader, and I actually trust the teens who read the books to figure things out, or maybe you can look something up, you can allude to stuff that you don't have to dump into the book, but you leave just enough of a clue so they know where to go dig deeper. And that also gets them more involved in the book afterwards or even during the process because they're engaged in the actual research. And when they can find those elements that actually show up in the book, it makes the book appear more real to them.
I love getting those emails where they're like they see an article in like the Huffington Post or something, and they're like, "Did you see this?
Yep.
This is just like your book." And I'm like, "Yes, it is.
I know.
Well done, you found it."
Yeah, it's great. So, you guys are.
I'm ready.
No, go for it.
Okay. I'm actually working on my first graphic novels right now, which is great. And even though the graphic novel, of course, you have so much more luxurious a time frame to work with than the monthly comic, I still manage to not think of something really critical until the second book. But it's like, hey, we got the dialogue polish, we've got that still to come. So yeah, exactly. And it doesn't have to be a plot point in the first one as long as it is mentioned and we know that it exists. I think as geeks, as science fiction and fantasy fans, we really tend to lionize the idea of they had it planned out all along. Yes, he had all 19 seasons in his head from the very first day of filming the pilot, and he knew what the last word would be. It was like, and so when I sold my first series, I was like, aha, I sat down and, plotted out those first 4 books and thought I was so smart. And like a solid month into working on the second book, I was like, why did I think I was never going to have another idea? Why did I believe that? And unfortunately, I'd kind of written myself in and I was a little bit stuck. You do have to come up with all of that background, science-y, or in my case, science hand-wavy, to support the story. But in the end, fundamentally, everything in there has to serve the story. The drama of it, the people in it. The rest is interesting, but the stuff that matters the most is what serves you the most. And if something has to give or change, you need to be able to have the room to do that if that's going to really support the drama of it or the characters in a more meaningful way.
I'd just like to say that while I don't plan specifically when I'm writing a novel, every single novel that I write, and graphic novel, not ongoing comics, but I always write the end first. I write the last sentence first because, and then I have no idea how I might get there, and I might not land exactly there. I might land just to the right of the mountain, but for me, if I don't know sort of where, if I, like Athena bursting out of the head, if I don't know the beginning and the end right at the beginning of when I'm going to write the book, then I don't have a North Star to sail by, and I don't know where I'm going, and then it's just sort of it becomes too open. So, just to jam on what you're saying, I don't, if I had done Lost, I would have known the ending before because,
for example,
I don't know if they did or not, but I'm just saying that I would have known because, or at least I would have been almost exactly there, just because that's how I like to. The fun for me is getting to that map point.
Yeah, for me, when I first started writing, I was like, I'm such a pantser. I always just go for it, and I'm terrible at outlining. And then when I started writing the series, I was like, I have to learn how to outline and plan things. So what I found really worked for me is creating a roadmap. And so I kind of pick out destinations, key emotional beats or scenes that I think would work, that would serve the story and the characters and the way they develop, and have an end destination in mind, but also being open to okay, let's say if you're doing a road trip, you're starting in one city, you want to end up in another city, but you're also having opportunity to take a detour, to go on a side trip, to explore something else. So having that, allowing myself that discoverableness was just giving myself permission to if I veer away from the outline, that's okay.
So we've now heard about hard sci-fi and a little bit of science hand-wavy. How do you where do you draw the line between like spec fic, hard sci-fi, and soft sci-fi? I mean, for yourselves and for other things, and where do y'all kind of fall on the spectrum?
Well, for me, does the story need the hard science detailed? I mean, I've written a lot of, I write a lot of weird science thrillers, the Joe Ledger series, weird science thrillers, and the science is important for the story. But I also read a lot of science fiction short stories in various levels of hard, soft, medium, undercooked, whatever. And if the science, the explanation of the science is important to understand, or the plot, or help the reader get to possibly guessing before you get there, then yeah, I'm going to put it in. But if it doesn't, I won't. I do a lot of media tie-in stuff. So I've done stories in the Aliens universe, the X-Files universe, the Predator universe, and so on. I don't actually need to pause for the science in those stories. It's not the effect of it, the fact that it's on an alien world, it's an alien species or something, is what matters more than the specifics of the science. Unless I was writing a science fiction story about a point of science, like if I was writing a story about the development of a hyperdrive, I would need to go into physics in that. I mean, that's relatively has to be a part of that. But if it's just about people going to another star system via some ship that can get them there, I don't need to give you a blueprint of the engine.
I think sometimes genre like separators like that are really just meant to separate. I mean, unless it's like for an award or something, like as long as you're working for the internal logic of the story, if that's like important to the story. Because I think you see things, especially in media today, that kind of explode the idea of genre. And I've been thinking about it a lot because I'm a big fan of the show Riverdale. And Riverdale kind of started out as this like noirish mystery, and like this last season it was a horror show. Like it is what it wants to be, and it follows its own sense of internal logic. And I was thinking about it when Claudia was talking about whether or not something is important to the story, something is important to the character. Because I'm 10 books into my career or something, and I'm watching Riverdale. And I had this epiphany that like changed my writing forever. And I don't know if anyone here watches Riverdale, but there's this scene, it's not a big spoiler, there's this character and her name is Cheryl, and she's extra. Like she's the most extra person. She always makes an entrance, she's always like way beyond anything. And there's this scene where she's running away from a serial killer. Just go with me. She's running away from a serial killer. She's trying to escape the serial killer. She like climbs out of her bedroom. Sarah's heard me tell this story. She climbs out of her bedroom and like out like down the vine or something, and she's running away, and he runs to the bedroom after her. He's not there, so he goes outside to look for her, and she has paused in her escape from the serial killer to don a red leather lace-up hunting cape and get her bow and arrow, and she shoots him with the bow and arrow that she has. We don't know anything about this bow and arrow beforehand, but now it's become a major plot point. But she has paused in running. She didn't just grab the bow and arrow. She laced up her red leather hunting cape in order to shoot him. And I paused the show and I just started cheering because the logic of it didn't matter. It was Cheryl Blossom, and she needed to lace up her red leather hunting cape in order to shoot the serial killer that she was running away from. Because it worked with the internal logic of Riverdale, and it worked with the internal logic of that character. And I was like, oh, they did it because it's cool.
That's right.
And for 10 years in my career, I was like, well, this would be cool, but is it realistic? And I always went realistic, which was dumb. I always go for cool. It was crazy. And I've had so much more fun writing when I was like, I'm always going to go for cool from now on if I have a choice. Even if it breaks the world building, if I make it work with my own internal logic that Cheryl Blossom would always, and so now when I talk to people about stories, I'm like, red leather hunting cape. Go for the cool. And that's also why it doesn't matter if you're world building for contemporary or sci-fi or fantasy, it's all the same. Riverdale.
With the Firebird books, I liked the idea that somewhere in some other universe, there was a version of that could be written as a hard science fiction novel, where the technology was something closer to being real and you could talk about all of this. And I'd read up enough to have sort of layperson knowledge, but at the same time I knew if I try to write that flat out, it's just going to be abusive to science, and I don't want to do it. So I very specifically made the main POV character, she's an aspiring artist. and she's grown up with her scientist parents, her scientist sister, scientist grad students, all in and around. Like, she's been surrounded by it her whole life. But she's the one person who doesn't follow that. Like, at one point, your consciousness travels, and I had to get into, well, what happens to your body? And so if she says something like, your body is in the original universe, but it's not observable. And if you ask what that means, they're going to start telling you about a cat that's in a box. And trust me, you don't want to hear the story. And I was able to just move on and hopefully make it sound like, if not real science, a real person who has been exasperated by scientists. Because there are some of those out there. Yeah. So, just having fun with it.
I like talking to scientists, so I'll call them up. Like for Tin Star, I had a scene where Tula has to put on a spacesuit and do an EVA, but she had never been in space. She'd never done that, because I figured that colonists probably aren't trained like astronauts, so I called NASA. And I was like, hello, I am an author. And they hooked me up with a spacewalking specialist who had just gotten off the International Space Station and was doing press. And so I got like 30 minutes with him. And I said, I just asked him the basic question. If you had to teach me, who knew nothing, how to do an EVA in a spacesuit, what would be your quick best advice? And he told me, and then that's what I put in the book. So a lot of the book there's not real science in it, but then there was a woman who helps design spacesuits, and she when I met her, and she was just like, you got that really right, and so I always try to talk to scientists. I feel like I am the character in your book because both my parents are scientists. My brother is a science journalist, and I'm the artist. I'm like, oh my God.
Yeah, my books are Cecil's backstory.
Wow. So let me just travel for a minute. So for me, like, science has always been like an important sort of spark. For that. So I love doing that kind of research, even though then I just spin it off into crazy.
So Cecil just like totally jumped my next question, which is no, it's great. So you've said now you have scientist family. Are any of the rest of you of like science backgrounds, and like what gets you into this research? And now I want to know how many of you / anybody else have just cold called NASA to ask questions. That's what I thought.
They're very responsive. You can pretty much cold call anyone.
Yeah, that's one of the things. I've never been turned down by an expert, and I've contacted so many of them because they want the science, they want the information right. I get contacted by a lot of my thriller friends to vet their fight scenes because I have a lot of background in that. So I'm an expert on the physics and physiology of fight scenes. But when I'm doing with NASA, I did it in the young adult novel about the first time he was going to colonize Mars. I got to speak with, I actually met Elon Musk at a party in Brentwood, and he hooked me up with a couple people. And I was at DragonCon a couple of years ago, met the woman who was designing the spacesuits, who was here, and also got invited to the JPL in California.
Yeah.
I've been to the CDC cold rooms here in Atlanta, or hot rooms rather. It's crazy that they want you to know how it works. Cops will do ride-alongs. I've been on a nuclear submarine for an 8-hour trip, which
Went to NORAD.
NORAD's great. Yeah. Meeting with the guys from DARPA. They really will. The problem there is getting them to shut up is the problem. Once they're in gear and they have a writer.
If you've decided I will take you out to drinks.
Oh, good.
And then it's like, but if you guys go to the space track here at DragonCon and you go up to them afterwards, they will talk. They will follow you back to their hotel room, nerding out about whatever thing they're planning to Saturn, and you're like, okay, all right, good night.
Three longest nights of my life, alcohol's involved in all three. Spec ops guys talking about their jobs over beer, ambulance drivers who have incredible stories, and ER doctors. And they're disgusting stories, but they're great, and they will talk and talk and talk and talk, and it's fantastic stuff.
I don't call as many experts because I am doing science fantasy. I do still check on things. I did check with somebody who paints in oils because she did that and I needed to know details about that. The one really big exception was in the original book, 1,000 Pieces of You. That's the first Firebird book. There's one universe where she's in Russia. And then there's another universe where her parents are oceanographers and she lives at this deep sea station. And if you're gonna write that book, it's really great to have a good friend who is a Russian oceanographer. And I actually thought of those worlds before. I was like, whoa, I know Marina. Her name is Marina. And she's a Pisces. Yes. And so she was, and the thing is, like, the rest of it could be science fantasy, but the ocean stuff actually had to be legit. It wasn't a huge plot point, but it had to be legit. And in fact, I had a couple things really wrong. I was like, oh my gosh, what must happen to the currents during this kind of storm? She's like, after about, a few meters down, it actually is not going to affect it that much. I'm like, oh. I don't know. But she was able to sort of tell me, like, here's where you could run into a problem. Here's where this could go on. So that was really, really helpful.
Can I just throw one little thing about that in there?
Yeah.
There's an old con man saying, use 9 truths to sell 1 lie.
Mm-hmm.
If we're using science in our books, we should put enough real science in there so it's hard for them to tell when we've taken that step over the line.
Carrie Ryan calls that the gimme.
Yep.
You get like so many gimmies in your book, and then after that, people are gonna be like, "Oh, this is crap."
I think the other nice thing about talking with experts is that, I once talked to an astrophysicist about dark matter because I wanted to use it to make it be what madness is in my comic Shape Changing Girl, and I was like, well, how can I see something fast in outer space, like in dark? He was like, oh, that would not. He was like, but here's what would be weird that would make us scientists on Earth take note and maybe try to change our telescopes to that direction. And that's the golden stuff. You know what I mean? That's you don't really necessarily go for the science facts to make everything work perfectly. What you go for is what would be the thing that would make somebody take notice.
I don't ask many experts a lot of things. I'm very research orientated, which mostly because I write books and notebooks of just information about the damn world. One thing that kind of go into the dark matter thing is it's really interesting when you're researching stuff or listening to experts about, and you find out, hey, there's this one thing that someone's mentioned, and now that becomes, oh, this just clicked, this just changed, and the entire book is now going to alter entire spheres to this new aspect.
Right.
Yeah.
That's one of my favorite research tricks is I go to the children's section in the library and I get the reference books in the children's section on, say I'm researching pirate ships or the space station or whatever, I get the children's books because the children's books will have diagrams and it will give me a good overview, and then anything that clicks like that, I'll go and get the adult book on that very specific, thing that I want to read. They've written a whole book out.
That's a good tip.
Yeah, go to the children's section and be like, I would like to read about Egyptian mythology, and then you get an overview, and then the one god, you're like, yes, that one.
Plus, and then if you have kids, you can just pass it on when you're done with it.
Right. Well, it's a library book, so you gotta take it back.
I actually studied science in college, so I did environmental science and geology, and I ended up doing an internship at JPL for a time doing Landsat satellite imagery and and it's funny because when you were talking about oh yeah, they can go on and on forever, I'm like, oh yeah, if someone is oh yeah, I'm very interested in that very specific thing that you spent years and years studying and becoming an expert in, it's fun to talk about, and it's it does lay some of the element in my books, but having that science, when you're going from I feel science is always, Cecil said, it's always a spark, and you take one cool thing, and a lot of the tech in my book actually already exists, clean energy, ready to go anytime. So but getting to see what actually exists and what would be an interesting way if it was utilized commonly or in everyday life.
Awesome. Do we have any audience questions? We've got about 10 minutes left, so yeah.
So you mentioned just a second ago that you write notebooks and notebooks of your world building. When you're doing that kind of world building where you're planning a lot of the stuff just for yourself in advance like that, do Do you find that you start in one place, but by the time you get to like when you're ready to write the book, that you've sort of completely morphed your original idea into something?
It kind of depends, because I usually have the characters first. It's their world. They're going to be dealing with all of the stuff that I throw at them. And then I try to say, okay, how are they going to do these things? And then it becomes a question of, okay, so we have this tech tree. How does that evolve? How does it go? And that's why I go to like propulsion, because propulsion is usually the basis of everything. Transportation builds countries. And using that as a basis, you can build out from there what is going to happen, how can they use this. And it can throw in like, okay, this is a challenge I didn't think that they would have before, that they have to overcome to get to this part, and so on and so forth. It can morph, it can change things. It can also invalidate ideas sometimes. And other times you're like, I'm really gonna have to like science the shit out of this to like fix this damn problem. And then it's also like the 9 truths and 1 lie that you just like, this is gonna be my one little lie that I'll do, and then we'll see how it goes.
Do you think your structure comes from the fact that you do the lit RPG stuff and the stats are so important? Like, do you think that those are connected in any way in your creative process?
It's definitely, I think it is, because like when you're playing a video game, you have an infrastructure, you have like the boundaries and walls and all that kind of thing to work through. But I relate it back to military experience, because you always know, hey, these are my walls, this is my lane, this is what I'm doing. And like, I know when I sometimes see movies or TV shows and there's like a military person who's acting completely not military, or doing like using tactics that make no sense, then I'm just like, that's
you
my
mean like in
breaking
Game of
point.
Thrones?
This is going to come up in 2 panels in a moment. We're not talking about Game of Thrones. Any other questions? If not, I'll ask more questions.
Well, I have one.
Yeah.
Well, you mentioned all your sci-fi or your science fiction, likes, but none of you mentioned The Expanse. Did anybody watch that show?
Mhm.
Oh, okay.
I gotta get on that. People keep telling me that I'm gonna love it.
Oh, yeah, that's
Yeah.
What I loved about The Expanse was I did not like the first, you know what I mean? Like, I was like, oh my God, like, this should be everything that I love, like, intersolar, like, whatever. And I was like, oh. But then, like my friend was like, just get past.
Gotta get past season
like, at least episode 5. And then I really fell in love with it, because it was just like you were saying about Riverdale being like a sort of aha moment for you. For me, the aha moment was at the very end of season 3, when I was like, oh, wow, what a pleasure to have the slow burn, the slow unrolling of a story. We're in such a world now where it's like, I don't know about you guys, where you have editors like saying like, you gotta have it on page 10. This person has to read this book. Like, I don't even know, whatever. Well, comic books are short, But like, it's like that to me is really one of the frustrating things, because it reminded me of the pleasure of a story sort of getting to have the time to breathe and unroll. And I like it a lot. But I forget about it because it was such resistance at the beginning.
Yeah, at the beginning it was a little slow.
Yeah.
I think going off that, actually, I really liked the slowness. Because it gave a depth to the characters, because they went through a lot of things. They went through relationship changes, they went through loss, they went through like finding other people, and you had the characters, like there was the core group, but there was a lot of movement around it, which is like, that's how the world works. And like, when they would have, hey, missiles work, machine guns work, it wasn't, we're gonna have an explanation of it, it's just, this is how it is, and this is how it's gonna work. Also, like the 0G stuff was awesome. So whoever like did all the wire training and stuff was great.
But you know what? The astronaut that I spoke to that did like consulted with my spacewalk thing, he consulted on The Expanse.
That's right. That's right. It does. The show does do that.
Yeah. So that was pretty cool.
Awesome.
Yeah, it was
Any other
nice to see a
questions?
science fiction show that actually handles
Science.
0G and
Yeah.
not just assumes, we'll just be walking down the corridor.
Yeah.
And if you read the books, that's a big part. It's all about acceleration couches.
Well, astronaut Rick Mastracchio, that's the guy who presented it.
I just want to say, I think that's wonderful that NASA actually takes the time to answer your questions, which is amazing. You didn't think they would. Nice to do.
Yeah,
Maybe don't get turned away.
The other people that are really helpful is zookeepers.
Yeah.
So like you can usually call the zoo and like explain that you're media and stuff, and like you don't even have to be like, I have a book deal. Like you can be like working on a book, and they will hook you up with the zookeeper, and the zookeeper will talk to you about whatever animal or whatever thing that you want to talk about, because they nerd out about it, and like probably their spouse is like sick of them coming home and being like, the naked mole rats today, guys. I don't want to hear it anymore.
Just in terms of experts that are willing to talk to you, although it's slightly off from what we're talking about, you go to something called Thriller Fest in New York. It's for thriller writers, but I've gone and it's been useful because they bring the ATF,
Right.
the CIA, etc., and they will talk you through, here's how the bomb dog works, here's how you develop an agent, and they bring different kinds, and all these people get them to ask questions like, but what if, and they'd always be like, nope, because boom, boom, boom,
We did that at Mink one year.
Yeah.
They walked us through like an arson thing, and they were like, here's how we figured out where the fire started.
But anyway, but they have officers that you can call that will talk to you, and in fact, the ATF people, if you were in the New York area, like these things feel like, I was like, I don't thank you. But, it's surprising how many avenues there are with people who are really just waiting to tell you.
I mean, there are some things that they don't, because I mean, I did a nuclear submarine once too, and they were like I didn't get to go, like we didn't go out. I just got to like go on it for a few hours, and but there were some spots where like they had covered shit up because we're not allowed to see that.
I'm imagining Chekhov. Where are the nuclear vessels?
I did have to sign up some papers when I went on.
Yeah, I did too.
But one of the things I found useful when working with, when I'm trying to build a world and working with experts is, we writers, like most people, just assume we know something. We often know enough to start a conversation with an expert, but we have to be open to the fact that we are going on assumptions, not necessarily fact. So I often when I'm talking to these people, the two questions I ask that really work for me. One is, what don't I know enough about this subject to even ask you? And that usually opens up a more useful dialogue, because they then start correcting a lot of the normal assumptions. And the second is, what's the coolest or weirdest thing happening in your field right now? I was doing a book about transgenics, and I asked that question. Somebody, one of the scientists said, well, the coolest, weirdest thing right now, this is back in 2009, are the spider goats. And there was a long moment of me going, what now? In Canada, they have these farms where they have been giving goats the gene from the orb weaver spider, so they produce vast quantities of spider silk in your milk, which is used for construction and.
What?
It's been going on for years.
That's some orcs and
I have no idea why.
Mind you, I was hoping for 8-legged goats like spider. Didn't get that. So I'm really upset about it. And I want that mutation. But it was so cool because I had no idea that was there. So it became a fun scene when one of the scientists mentions it to the hero in my story, and he's like, spider goats, really? Because the reaction, there are spider goats now.
We expect them to stick into the wall.
Yeah, I seriously want them up, and I want the constant piping of the Spider-Man theme song in the lab.
Yeah, I actually think what you said, Jonathan, I think it really, like, the number one trap of world building, or really anything that involves any kind of research, what will get you is not what you don't know. It's what you think you know and don't.
Yeah,
That is the trouble area.
When people are asking me about fight scenes, a lot of misconceptions about fight scenes, like people actually think you can push the nose bone into the brain. No, you can't. They think you can pull the heart out while somebody's still alive. No, you can't. A lot of stuff you can't do.
What?
I know. You're shocked. But I was reading, like Stephen King's Firestarter has the assassin playing to kill someone in a way that's impossible. Shirley Conran had it, one of her novels. I was in the movie The Last Boy Scout. It's physiologically impossible to do it that way, but it's common knowledge. So
like everybody bleeds from the mouth when they die somehow.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
or that you
does that.
bleed when you die.
Yeah.
Heart stops pumping. No, it's not bleeding going on.
Yeah.
So asking these questions allows an expert to refine the knowledge in that way. Not only are you telling a more interesting story, you're telling a story grounded in reality, which allows the suspension of disbelief not to make a fool of the reader. Because you want it to be clear that you respect them enough to have done your homework to give them the best possible book.
Yeah.
All right, so with that, we're out of time. I can't believe it. I looked down and I was like, no, because I think this has been a great panel. So let's give these people a round of applause. No. Okay. We're good. So raise your hand if you did not get a ticket. I feel like, oh, we got one up here. Because we, at YLit, raffle off some books at the end of all of our panels. And then, while I'm waiting for Margie, on your way out, you will see our house cut boxes. We vote for your house with your money, and that's how we raise funds for the DragonCon's charity, which this year is the American Heart Association. So, go Hufflepuff.
That's right.
We can't let Slytherin win again.
No, we can't.
No, we can't.
While you're doing this, do you guys know about the charity auctions? Like all the guests here have donated books and other important things to charity auctions. The book one is going on tomorrow morning. I have donated an advanced reader copy of my new book, In the Hall with the Knife. It is based on the board game Clue. And in one of them, it comes in this special media box that they sent to all the newspapers and stuff. It's so cool. It looks exactly like the game. And the other one that I donated comes with a special Clue card game. And I will kill you in one of the Clue novels if you bid on that one. So everybody go down, check out the charity. It's tomorrow morning. You can find it on your schedule. All the guests have donated books and Tuckerizations, that's called, if you kill a character in your novel or something. But do it.
Oh,
Okay.
Can I mention that I'm in Comic Pop Alley at table 527?
Well, you just did.
Yeah, I'm at Bard's Tower off and on throughout the con.
Okay,
I'm
so
at booth 252.
I really have to wrap up fast, but if y'all got anything, thank you.
Wait, can we just take a picture?
You can do it first.
Yeah.
I'm just gonna